They thought they had found the perfect target when they forced the quiet new student to wear that humiliating dunce cap in front of the entire class. Tyler Rodriguez and his crew had no idea that Marcus Thompson had been studying the ancient art of discipline and respect since he could barely walk. What happened next didn't just change how the school saw Marcus. It transformed how an entire community understood the true meaning of strength. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn air carried the sound of school bells and shuffling sneakers across the concrete pathways of Lincoln Middle School in Riverside, Ohio. Yellowing maple leaves drifted past tall windows where fluorescent lights cast their sterile glow over rows of metal desks and plastic chairs. The hallways buzzed with that particular energy of a school 3 weeks into the fall semester, when social hierarchies had already solidified and every student knew exactly where they belonged in the invisible rankings that govern teenage life. Marcus Thompson stood at his locker, methodically organizing his textbooks with the same quiet precision he brought to everything else. At 13, he possessed an unusual stillness for someone his age, moving with deliberate care rather than the chaotic energy that seemed to radiate from his classmates. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, his clothes clean but unremarkable, and his brown eyes held a depth that most adults twice his age hadn't yet achieved. To the casual observer, Marcus appeared to be exactly what Tyler Rodriguez had pegged him as on that first day of school, the perfect victim. Tyler commanded respect through fear at Lincoln Middle School, a stocky 14-year-old with bleached tips in his auburn hair and a collection of designer sneakers that announced his family's financial status to anyone within eyeshot. His father owned 3 car dealerships across the county, and Tyler had learned early that money could buy influence, even in the 7th grade. He surrounded himself with Jake Mitchell and Connor Walsh, 2 boys who had discovered that aligning themselves with Tyler's cruelty was easier than risking becoming targets themselves. Jake was tall for his age but thin, with nervous energy that made him constantly fidget with his phone or drum his fingers against whatever surface was nearby. Connor was the opposite, shorter and broader, with a round face that might have been friendly if not for the perpetual smirk he wore whenever Tyler was around. Together, they formed a trio that had made life miserable for countless students over the past 2 years, always careful to stay just below the radar of serious administrative consequences. The morning of the incident began like any other Tuesday. In room 204, where Mrs. Sarah Chun taught 7th grade American history with the kind of passionate dedication that made her both beloved by serious students and ignored by troublemakers. She had been teaching for 12 years, long enough to recognize the subtle dynamics that played out in her classroom but experienced enough to handle them with strategic intervention rather than heavy-handed authority. Mrs. Chun had noticed Marcus from his first day, not because he caused problems, but because of the way he listened, really listened, with an attentiveness that was becoming increasingly rare among her students. She had also noticed Tyler's growing fixation on the new student, the way his eyes would narrow whenever Marcus answered a question correctly or received praise for his thoughtful contributions to class discussions. Mrs. Chun had seen this pattern before, the way certain students seemed to take personal offense at excellence in others, as if someone else's success somehow diminished their own worth. She had been watching, waiting for the right moment to address it before it escalated beyond her classroom management. That Tuesday was presentation day, when students were scheduled to share their research projects on American inventors. Marcus had chosen to focus on Garrett Morgan, the African-American inventor who created the traffic signal and gas mask, spending hours at the Riverside Public Library, researching details that went far beyond the basic requirements of the assignment. His presentation was thorough, well-organized, and delivered with a quiet confidence that impressed Mrs. Chun and clearly irritated Tyler. When Marcus finished his presentation and returned to his seat. Tyler raised his hand with the kind of theatrical enthusiasm that immediately put Mrs. Chun on alert. She recognized that particular brand of fake eagerness, the way students sometimes volunteered when they had something other than learning on their minds. "Mrs. Chun," Tyler said, his voice carrying just the right amount of innocent curiosity, "I think Marcus did such a good job that maybe he deserves some kind of special recognition. You know, something that really shows how smart he is." Before Mrs. Chun could respond, Tyler was already moving toward the supply closet where she kept various props and materials for her lessons. Among them was an old pointed hat, a relic from a previous teacher's medieval history unit that had somehow never been thrown away. Tyler grabbed it with the quick efficiency of someone who had been planning this moment. His movements coordinated with Jake and Connor in a way that suggested this was not spontaneous at all. The room fell silent as Tyler approached Marcus's desk, the pointed hat held high like some kind of trophy. Connor moved to block the aisle while Jake positioned himself near the door, creating what any observer would recognize as a coordinated trap. Mrs. Chun stood up immediately, her voice sharp with authority as she commanded Tyler to return to his seat, but the damage was already in motion. "Come on, Marcus," Tyler said, loud enough for the entire class to hear. "Everyone knows you're the smartest kid in here. You should wear this so we can all see how special you are." The sarcasm dripped from his words like poison, and several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing the cruelty disguised as praise. Marcus remained perfectly still, his hands folded on his desk, his breathing steady and controlled. To most observers, he appeared frozen by fear or embarrassment, unable to respond to the public humiliation being thrust upon him. Tyler took the stillness as victory, placing the pointed hat on Marcus's head while Connor and Jake snickered appreciatively at their leader's performance. What Tyler couldn't see, what none of them could understand, was that Marcus's stillness came from a completely different source. In his mind, he could hear his grandfather's voice, calm and patient as it had been during thousands of hours of training over the past 7 years. "When someone attacks you, Marcus, the first thing you do is breathe. You center yourself. You find your balance. Then you decide how to respond." Henry Thompson had been teaching martial arts for over 40 years before his grandson was born. First in the military and later at small dojos in Portland, Oregon, where Marcus had lived before moving to Riverside. Hank, as everyone called him, had begun training Marcus when the boy was barely 6 years old, not because he wanted to create a fighter, but because he understood that true martial arts were about discipline, respect, and the confidence that came from knowing you could protect yourself and others when necessary. The training had been gradual and thorough, built on principles that went far deeper than physical techniques. Hank had taught Marcus about the history of jujitsu, how it had been developed by samurai who needed to defend themselves when disarmed, how it emphasized using an opponent's strength and momentum against them rather than relying on brute force. More importantly, he had taught Marcus about responsibility, about the weight that came with possessing skills that could seriously hurt another person. "The strongest person in the room," Hank had told his grandson repeatedly, "is often the one who chooses not to fight." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Real strength is about protecting others, not proving yourself. You use these skills only when someone is truly in danger, when there's no other choice. For 7 years, Marcus had absorbed these lessons along with the physical training, practicing forms and techniques until they became as natural as breathing. He had learned to read body language, to anticipate movements, to remain calm under pressure. He had also learned restraint, the most difficult lesson of all, understanding that his growing abilities came with the responsibility to use them wisely. Sitting in room 204 with Tyler's makeshift dunce cap on his head, Marcus felt the familiar calm that came from years of meditation and mental discipline. He could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, some sympathetic, others amused, most simply relieved that they weren't the ones being targeted. He could hear Mrs. Chun's increasingly sharp commands for Tyler to stop his behavior and return to his seat. He could sense Tyler's growing excitement as he interpreted Marcus's lack of response as weakness. But Marcus was not weak, and he was not afraid. He was calculating, measuring, waiting. His grandfather had taught him to recognize the difference between someone who was genuinely dangerous and someone who was simply cruel. Tyler was a bully, not a real threat, and Marcus knew that responding with physical force would be disproportionate to the situation. Instead, he chose a different kind of strength. Slowly, deliberately, Marcus reached up and removed the pointed hat from his head. He set it gently on his desk, then stood up with the fluid grace that came from years of martial arts training. The movement was so smooth, so controlled, that it immediately changed the energy in the room. Students who had been watching with cruel amusement suddenly sat up straighter, sensing that something had shifted. Tyler, caught off guard by Marcus's calm response, took a step backward. "What are you going to do, new kid?" he asked, but there was a tremor in his voice that hadn't been there before. He had expected tears, anger, or cowering submission. He hadn't expected this quiet, centered presence that seemed to fill the space around Marcus like an invisible force field. Marcus looked directly at Tyler, his brown eyes steady and unblinking. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried clearly to every corner of the room. "I'm going to thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for showing everyone in this room what kind of person you choose to be. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to show them what kind of person I choose to be." The words hit Tyler like a physical blow, their simple dignity exposing the cruelty of his actions in a way that no amount of anger or retaliation could have achieved. Mrs. Chun, who had been moving toward the front of the room to intervene, stopped short, recognizing that something profound was happening between these two students. Marcus continued, his voice still calm and respectful. "I know you think I'm weak because I'm new here, because I keep to myself, because I don't try to prove anything to anyone. But strength isn't about making other people feel small. My grandfather taught me that real strength is about lifting others up, about protecting people who need protection, about choosing kindness even when someone doesn't deserve it." He paused, letting the words settle in the suddenly quiet room. Several students were leaning forward now, hanging on every word. This was not the response they had expected from the quiet new kid who usually faded into the background. "So thank you, Tyler," Marcus continued, "for reminding me why my grandfather's lessons matter. Thank you for showing me that even here, in a new place where I don't know anyone, I can still choose to be the person he raised me to be." Tyler's face had gone red, but not with anger. For the first time in his life, he was experiencing the uncomfortable sensation of genuine shame, of seeing himself reflected in someone else's words and not liking what he saw. Jake and Connor had moved away from him slightly, no longer proud to be associated with what was happening. Mrs. Chun stepped forward then, her voice gentle but firm. "Tyler, Jake, Connor, please take your seats. We need to have a conversation about respect and kindness in this classroom." But her eyes were on Marcus, and in them, he saw something that made all the years of training and discipline worthwhile. He saw recognition, respect, and perhaps most importantly, he saw hope. As Tyler slumped back to his desk, the pointed hat forgotten on the floor where it had fallen, Marcus quietly returned to his seat. The presentation period continued, but the atmosphere in the room had fundamentally changed. Students who had never spoken to Marcus before were looking at him with new eyes, seeing not the quiet outsider they had dismissed, but someone who possessed a kind of strength they were only beginning to understand. What none of them knew yet was that this moment in room 204 was only the beginning. Word of what had happened would spread through Lincoln Middle School like wildfire, carried by students who had witnessed something they couldn't quite explain, but knew was important. The story would reach the principal's office, the teacher's lounge, and eventually the wider community of Riverside, where people were hungry for examples of young people choosing courage over cruelty. But more than that, Marcus's response would plant seeds in the minds of his classmates, seeds that would grow into questions about their own choices, their own definitions of strength, their own responsibilities to each other. Tyler Rodriguez would go home that night and, for the first time in years, really look at himself in the mirror and wonder who he had become. Mrs. Chun would call Marcus's grandfather that evening to share what had happened, leading to a conversation that would change both the school and the community in ways none of them could have anticipated. The quiet new kid who had seemed like such an easy target had revealed himself to be something else entirely, not through violence or aggression, but through a kind of moral courage that was far more powerful than any physical technique he had learned in 7 years of martial arts training. In choosing dignity over retaliation, respect over revenge, Marcus Thompson had won a victory that would echo far beyond the walls of room 204, touching lives and changing hearts in ways that would unfold over the days and weeks to come. The silence that followed Marcus's words stretched across room 204 like morning fog over the Scioto River, thick and heavy with unspoken thoughts. Mrs. Chun had taught long enough to recognize moments when the entire trajectory of a classroom dynamic could shift, and she felt it happening now as she watched 28 7th graders process what they had just witnessed. The pointed hat lay forgotten on the linoleum floor, a symbol of cruelty transformed into evidence of something far more powerful. Tyler Rodriguez remained frozen at his desk, his usual swagger replaced by something unfamiliar and deeply uncomfortable. The red flush had spread from his cheeks down his neck, and his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of his desk. For someone who had spent the last 2 years building his reputation on the ability to make others feel small, Marcus's response had been like stepping into quicksand. Every word had pulled him deeper into a realization he wasn't prepared to face. Jake Mitchell sat 3 desks away, his nervous energy completely stilled for perhaps the first time since kindergarten. His phone lay untouched on his desk, forgotten in the wake of witnessing something that couldn't be captured in a social media post or reduced to a viral moment. The tall, thin boy who had learned to survive by following Tyler's lead found himself questioning every choice that had brought him to this moment. Connor Walsh, whose round face had worn that perpetual smirk for so long it had become his default expression, now looked younger somehow, more vulnerable. The armor of cynicism he had built around himself had cracked, revealing glimpses of the boy he had been before he learned that cruelty could be a form of protection. Mrs. Chun moved slowly to the front of the classroom, each step deliberate and measured. She had handled countless disciplinary situations over her 12 years of teaching, but this felt different. This wasn't about punishment or consequences in the traditional sense. This was about something deeper, about the kind of teachable moment that came along perhaps once in a career, if a teacher was fortunate enough to recognize it. Lily Anderson, who sat in the second row near the windows, felt her heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She had watched the entire scene unfold with growing amazement, witnessing something she had only read about in books or seen in movies. The quiet new kid who ate lunch alone and never raised his hand unless called upon had just demonstrated a kind of courage that left her breathless. Lily had been the target of Tyler's crew herself last year, spending 3 miserable months dodging their taunts about her second-hand clothes and her mother's job cleaning houses. She knew intimately the feeling of powerlessness that came from being singled out, which made Marcus's response all the more remarkable. As Mrs. Chun reached her desk, she turned to face the class with the kind of expression that immediately commanded attention. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of someone who understood that education extended far beyond textbooks and test scores. "What we just witnessed," she began quietly, "is perhaps the most important lesson any of us will encounter this year. Mr. Thompson has shown us something that many adults spend their entire lives trying to understand. He has shown us that how we respond to cruelty defines us far more than the cruelty itself ever could. She paused, letting her gaze move across the faces of her students, seeing the mix of confusion, admiration, and uncomfortable self-reflection in their eyes. History is full of moments when individuals had to choose between retaliation and dignity, between revenge and respect. Today, in this classroom, we had our own historical moment. Marcus remained seated, his hands folded on his desk, but Mrs. Chun could see the slight tension in his shoulders that suggested he wasn't as calm as he appeared. She recognized something in his posture, a controlled alertness that reminded her of her own father, who had served in Vietnam and carried himself with that same quiet readiness long after he returned home. The bell that marked the end of third period rang with its usual harsh electronic tone, but not a single student moved. The spell cast by the morning's events held them in place, as if moving would somehow break the fragile understanding that had settled over the room. Mrs. Chun made a decision that would later be discussed in faculty meetings and parent conferences for weeks to come. "Class," she said, "I want you to think about what happened here today. Really think about it. Tomorrow we're going to discuss it, and I want each of you to be prepared to share one thing you learned about courage, about strength, about the kind of person you want to be." As students finally began to gather their belongings, moving with unusual quiet and thoughtfulness, Marcus found himself surrounded by classmates who had never spoken to him before. Emma Rodriguez, no relation to Tyler despite the shared surname, approached his desk with tentative steps. "That was incredible," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rustling of papers and zipping of backpacks. "I've never seen anyone handle Tyler like that before." Marcus looked up at her, seeing genuine admiration in her eyes mixed with something else, something that looked like hope. "It wasn't about handling him," he replied gently. "It was about not letting him handle me." The distinction seemed to resonate with Emma, who nodded slowly as if filing away a piece of wisdom she would need later. Other students hovered nearby, clearly wanting to approach but uncertain how to bridge the gap between their previous indifference and their current curiosity. Tyler, meanwhile, had remained at his desk long after most of his classmates had filed out of the room. Jake and Connor had left without him, their usual post-incident celebration replaced by uncomfortable silence and averted eyes. For the first time in recent memory, Tyler found himself truly alone. Not by choice, but because his actions had isolated him in a way he was only beginning to understand. Mrs. Chun approached Tyler's desk as the last of the other students disappeared into the hallway. She had dealt with bullies before, but she had learned over the years that underneath the cruelty usually lay something more complex, more human, more redeemable than the surface behavior suggested. "Tyler," she said, her voice neither harsh nor sympathetic, simply direct, "I think you and I need to have a conversation." Tyler looked up at her, and for just a moment, his carefully constructed facade crumbled completely. Mrs. Chun saw what she had suspected was there all along, a 13-year-old boy who had somehow learned that making others feel small was the only way he knew to feel big himself. "I didn't mean for it to go like that," Tyler said, his voice smaller than she had ever heard it. "I just thought he would cry or get mad or something normal. I didn't expect him to say those things." Mrs. Chun pulled up a chair and sat down beside Tyler's desk, a gesture that surprised him. Teachers didn't usually sit with students, especially not students who had just caused a scene in their classroom. "Tell me," she said, "how did you expect to feel after you made Marcus wear that hat? What did you think would happen inside you when you succeeded in humiliating him?" The question caught Tyler off guard. No adult had ever asked him about his internal experience of bullying before. Most focused on the impact on his victims or the consequences he would face. None had wondered about the hollowness that always followed his moments of perceived victory. "I don't know," Tyler admitted, and for the first time in months, he was telling the complete truth. "I guess I thought I would feel better about myself. But I never really do. I just feel empty, and then I have to do something else to try to fill it up again." Mrs. Chin nodded, recognizing the honesty in his admission. "That's because you're trying to build yourself up by tearing others down. And that's like trying to fill a bucket that has holes in the bottom. No matter how much you pour in, it never stays full." The metaphor hit Tyler with unexpected force. He could picture it clearly, the futile effort of pouring water into a damaged container, watching it drain away as quickly as it entered. That was exactly how his life felt, a constant effort to achieve something that never lasted, never satisfied, never filled the empty space that seemed to grow larger with each cruel act. As Tyler grappled with this revelation, Marcus was experiencing his own aftermath in the hallway outside. Room 204. Word of what had happened was spreading through Lincoln Middle School with the speed that only dramatic social events could achieve. Among teenagers, students who had witnessed the scene were recounting it to friends, each retelling adding layers of interpretation and emphasis. By lunchtime, Marcus found himself in the unusual position of being the center of attention in the cafeteria, a place where he had previously been invisible. Students approached his table with varying degrees of confidence, some offering congratulations, others simply staring with curiosity, many asking questions about how he had remained so calm under pressure. "Weren't you scared?" asked David Park, a small sixth grader who had been Tyler's victim earlier in the year. "I would have been terrified." Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. "I was concerned," he said finally, "but not scared in the way you might think. My grandfather taught me that fear usually comes from not knowing what to do. When you know what to do, when you've trained for different situations, fear becomes just information." The distinction fascinated David and the other students who had gathered around Marcus's table. They were accustomed to thinking of fear as something to be avoided or overcome, not as information to be processed and used. "What kind of training?" asked Sarah Williams, a seventh grader who had always been too shy to speak up in class, but found her curiosity overcoming her usual reticence. Marcus hesitated, aware that he was approaching territory his grandfather had warned him about. Hank had always emphasized the importance of humility, of not using his martial arts knowledge as a way to gain status or intimidate others, but he also recognized that these students were asking genuine questions, seeking to understand something that had clearly moved them. "My grandfather has been teaching me martial arts since I was little," Marcus said carefully. "But it's not really about fighting. It's more about discipline, about understanding yourself and other people, about staying calm when things get difficult." The revelation sent a ripple of excitement through the gathered students. The quiet new kid wasn't just morally courageous. He was trained in actual martial arts. The combination seemed almost too perfect, like something from a movie or a book. But Marcus quickly sensed the shift in their attention and moved to redirect it. "The most important thing my grandfather taught me," he continued, "isn't any physical technique. It's that real strength comes from choosing not to use your power when you could. Anyone can hurt someone who's weaker than them. It takes real strength to protect someone, to lift them up instead of knocking them down." Across the cafeteria, Tyler sat alone at a table that usually hosted his crew and several other students who orbited around his social influence. Today, the table felt enormous and empty. Jake and Connor had found seats elsewhere, their discomfort, with the morning's events evident in their avoidance of their usual leader. Tyler found himself watching Marcus interact with the growing group of students, seeing something he had never noticed before. Marcus wasn't trying to impress anyone or build up his own reputation. He was genuinely engaging with each person who approached him, listening to their questions and responding with thoughtful answers that seemed to make them feel better about themselves rather than worse. It was the opposite of everything Tyler had learned about social dynamics, the inverse of the strategies he had used to build his own position in the school's hierarchy. Marcus was gaining influence not by diminishing others but by elevating them, not by creating fear but by inspiring respect. The realization was both illuminating and deeply unsettling for Tyler. If Marcus was right, if real strength came from lifting others up, then everything Tyler had done to build his reputation had actually made him weaker, not stronger. Every cruel comment, every public humiliation, every moment of manufactured superiority had been digging him deeper into a hole he was only now beginning to see. As the lunch period continued, Mrs. Shen found herself in the teacher's lounge, discussing the morning's events with her colleagues. The story had spread through the faculty as quickly as it had through the student body, and the response from the adults was just as varied and intense. "I heard Tyler Rodriguez finally met his match," said Mr. Johnson, the 8th grade science teacher who had dealt with Tyler's behavior in previous years. "About time someone stood up to that kid." But Mrs. Chun shook her head. "It wasn't about standing up to him, not in the way you mean. Marcus didn't defeat Tyler through confrontation or retaliation. He did something much more powerful. He responded to cruelty with dignity, and in doing so, he held up a mirror that forced Tyler to see himself clearly for perhaps the first time." Mrs. Patterson, the school counselor, looked up from her lunch with interest. "That's a sophisticated response from a 13-year-old. Most kids would have either fought back or broken down. This boy did neither. He found a third option." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Principal Martinez, whose usually calm demeanor showed signs of the stress that came with managing the aftermath of significant school incidents. David Martinez had been principal at Lincoln Middle School for 5 years, long enough to recognize when something unusual was happening in his building. "Sarah," he said, addressing Mrs. Chun, "I've been getting calls from parents all morning about some kind of incident in your classroom. Can you fill me in on what actually happened?" Mrs. Chun provided a detailed account of the morning's events, watching as Principal Martinez's expression shifted from concern about potential violence to amazement at the maturity and wisdom displayed by Marcus. As an administrator, Martinez had dealt with countless bullying situations, most of which followed predictable patterns of escalation, intervention, and consequence. This was something entirely different. "I'd like to meet with this Marcus Thompson," Martinez said after Mrs. Chun finished her account. "And I think we need to consider how to use this situation as a learning opportunity for the entire school community." The principal's response reflected a growing awareness that what had happened in room 204 that morning had implications that extended far beyond a simple disciplinary matter. This was the kind of incident that could change the culture of a school, but only if it was handled with the same wisdom and thoughtfulness that Marcus had demonstrated. As the school day continued, the effects of the morning's confrontation continued to ripple outward in ways both obvious and subtle. Students who had never paid attention to Marcus before found themselves seeking him out, drawn by curiosity about someone who could remain so composed under pressure. Others, particularly those who had been victims of bullying themselves, approached him with a mixture of admiration and hope, as if his example had shown them a possibility they had never considered. But perhaps the most significant impact was on those students who had previously been part of Tyler's orbit, either as active participants in his cruelty or passive enablers of his behavior. Seeing their leader rendered speechless by simple human dignity had forced them to confront uncomfortable questions about their own choices and the kind of people they wanted to be. Jake Mitchell found himself thinking about every mean comment he had made, every time he had laughed at someone else's humiliation, every moment he had chosen to follow rather than lead. The memory of Marcus's calm strength made his own past actions feel petty and shameful in a way he had never experienced before. Connor Walsh was experiencing a similar reckoning, his perpetual smirk replaced by thoughtful silence as he reconsidered the foundation upon which he had built his middle school identity. The boy who had learned to protect himself through preemptive Cruelty was beginning to wonder if there might be other ways to navigate the complex social landscape of adolescence. As the final bell of the day rang and students began their exodus from Lincoln Middle School, Marcus gathered his belongings with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything else. The day had been unlike any he had experienced since moving to Riverside, filled with conversations and interactions that felt both overwhelming and encouraging. But as he walked toward the school's main entrance, Marcus found his path blocked by a familiar figure. Tyler Rodriguez stood near the door, no longer flanked by his usual companions, no longer projecting the aggressive confidence that had defined his presence in the school. Instead, he looked uncertain, vulnerable, and very young. "Marcus," Tyler said, his voice barely above a whisper, "can I talk to you for a minute?" The request surprised Marcus, who had expected Tyler to avoid him indefinitely rather than seek out further interaction. But he recognized something in Tyler's posture, a defeated quality that reminded him of his grandfather's teachings about the difference between an enemy and someone who was simply lost. "Sure," Marcus replied, his tone neither warm nor cold, simply open to whatever Tyler needed to say. They walked together toward a quiet corner of the school's courtyard, away from the streams of students heading toward buses and cars. The autumn afternoon sun filtered through the oak trees that had been planted when the school was built, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the concrete pathways. Tyler struggled to find words for what he wanted to express, his usual verbal aggression useless for the conversation he needed to have. Finally, he looked directly at Marcus and spoke with an honesty that surprised them both. "I don't know how to be different," Tyler admitted, his voice thick with emotions he didn't fully understand. "I've been this way for so long, I don't remember how to be anything else. But what you did today, what you said, it made me see something about myself that I didn't want to see." Marcus listened without interrupting, recognizing the courage it took for Tyler to make this admission. His grandfather had taught him that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was acknowledge their own mistakes and ask for help in becoming better. "Everyone can change," Marcus said simply. "But it has to come from inside. Nobody can make you different. You have to decide who you want to be, and then do the work to become that person." The words carried weight because they came without judgment or condescension. Marcus wasn't offering easy forgiveness or pretending that Tyler's past actions didn't matter. Instead, he was acknowledging the possibility of transformation while making clear that the responsibility for that change belonged entirely to Tyler himself. As the two boys stood in the courtyard, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of a school day ending, something significant was shifting in the social ecosystem of Lincoln Middle School. The conversation between Marcus and Tyler was just one part of a larger transformation that would continue to unfold in the days and weeks to come, touching lives and changing perspectives in ways that none of them could fully predict. The quiet new kid who had seemed like such an easy target had revealed himself to be a catalyst for something much larger than anyone had anticipated. Through his simple choice to respond to cruelty with dignity, Marcus Thompson had planted seeds of change that would grow in directions and dimensions that were only beginning to become visible. The conversation between Marcus and Tyler in the courtyard lasted only 15 minutes, but those 15 minutes would prove to be among the most important in both of their young lives. As other students streamed past them toward waiting buses and parent pickup lines, the two boys found themselves in a bubble of honest communication that felt almost surreal after the morning's confrontation. Tyler had never experienced the kind of listening that Marcus offered him. There was no judgment in Marcus's brown eyes, no impatience or superiority, just a steady presence that somehow made it safe for Tyler to voice thoughts he had never shared with anyone. The boy who had built his identity on never showing weakness found himself describing the hollow feeling that followed each act of cruelty, the way victory never felt like he thought it should, the growing sense that he was trapped in a pattern he didn't know how to escape. My dad always says that people respect strength, Tyler said, his voice uncertain for perhaps the first time since elementary school. He says that's how you get ahead in life, by making sure everyone knows you're not someone to mess with. But what you did today, that felt stronger than anything I've ever done, and you didn't hurt anybody. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding that Tyler was trying to reconcile two very different philosophies of power and influence. My grandfather taught me that there are different kinds of strength, Marcus replied. There's the strength that comes from making people afraid of you, and there's the strength that comes from making people feel safe around you. The first kind makes you powerful, but the second kind makes you respected. The distinction hit Tyler with the force of revelation. He had spent years confusing fear with respect, assuming that the silence his presence created meant people looked up to him. But Marcus's words helped him see that what he had interpreted as admiration was actually just people trying to avoid becoming his next target. As they talked, Marcus found himself thinking about his grandfather and the conversations they had shared during long training sessions at the dojo in Portland. Henry Thompson had experienced both kinds of strength during his military service and his subsequent years teaching martial arts. He had seen how the ability to inflict harm could be used to control others, but he had also witnessed the deeper power that came from using that same ability to protect and serve. The hardest lesson I ever learned, Hank had told Marcus during one particularly intense training session, was that being strong enough to hurt someone and choosing not to do it is worth more than winning 100 fights. Any fool can throw a punch. It takes wisdom to know when not to. Those words had echoed in Marcus's mind throughout the morning's confrontation with Tyler, reminding him that his years of training had been building toward moments exactly like this one. Not moments of physical conflict, but moments when he would have to choose between different ways of responding to aggression. Tyler's admission about his father's philosophy also resonated with something Marcus had observed during his first weeks at Lincoln Middle School. He had noticed the way certain students seemed to operate from a worldview that valued dominance over cooperation, winning over wisdom, control over compassion. It was a perspective that made sense in certain contexts, but when applied to relationships, between young people trying to figure out who they were and where they belonged, it created more problems than it solved. As their conversation continued, Tyler found himself asking questions he had never thought to ask before. How do you know when you're being strong in the right way? How do you know when you should stand up to someone and when you should just walk away? Marcus considered the question carefully, drawing on years of his grandfather's teachings and his own growing understanding of human nature. I think it depends on whether you're trying to protect someone or just trying to prove something, he said finally. If someone is genuinely being hurt and you can help them, that's one thing. But if you're just trying to show everyone how tough you are, that's something else entirely. The framework Tyler had been offered was simple but profound, providing a way to evaluate his own motivations that he had never possessed before. Looking back on his behavior over the past 2 years, Tyler realized that almost everything he had done had been about proving something rather than protecting anyone. Even when he told himself he was defending his reputation or his position in the school's social hierarchy, he was really just trying to convince himself and others that he mattered. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Chun, who had been looking for both boys after noticing they had not boarded their usual buses. She approached them with the cautious optimism of an educator who sensed that something positive was happening but didn't want to disturb it with premature intervention. I wanted to make sure you both got home safely, she said, her tone carefully neutral. Tyler, your mother called the school looking for you. Tyler's face immediately tensed at the mention of his mother. Carol Rodriguez had built a successful career in real estate by projecting an image of perfection and control, and she did not handle situations that threatened that image well. The phone call from the school about Tyler's behavior that morning had undoubtedly triggered her particular brand of anxious anger. "I should probably go," Tyler said, but he hesitated, looking back at Marcus with an expression that seemed to convey both gratitude and uncertainty about what came next. Marcus extended his hand, a gesture that surprised both Tyler and Mrs. Chun. "It was good talking with you," Marcus said simply. "Really talking, I mean." Tyler shook Marcus's hand, feeling the unexpected strength in the other boy's grip, and understanding for the first time that Marcus could have used that strength in many different ways. The fact that he had chosen patience and conversation over confrontation made the gesture even more meaningful. After Tyler left to face whatever consequences awaited him at home, Mrs. Chun walked with Marcus toward the area where his grandfather would be picking him up. The elderly man had been coming to the school every day since Marcus started, arriving early and waiting patiently in his old Toyota truck until his grandson emerged from the building. "That was a remarkable thing you did today," Mrs. Sheen said as they walked. Both in the classroom and just now with Tyler, most adults would have handled those situations with far less grace than you showed. Marcus looked uncomfortable with the praise, a reaction that Mrs. Chun found even more impressive than his earlier composure. "My grandfather always says that how we treat people when they're at their worst tells us who we really are," Marcus replied. "Tyler was at his worst this morning, but that doesn't mean that's who he really is." The insight demonstrated a level of emotional intelligence that Mrs. Chun had rarely encountered in her students. Marcus had not only managed his own response to Tyler's aggression, but had also maintained empathy for the person behind the behavior. It was the kind of perspective that suggested both natural wisdom and careful cultivation through years of thoughtful guidance. As they reached the pickup area, Mrs. Chun could see Henry Thompson waiting in his truck, his weathered hands resting on the steering wheel, and his eyes scanning the emerging students with the patient alertness of someone accustomed to waiting and watching. Even from a distance, there was something about the old man's posture that suggested both strength and gentleness, the same combination she had observed in his grandson. "Mr. Thompson," Mrs. Chun called out as they approached the truck. "I wonder if I might have a word with you about Marcus." Hank rolled down his window and studied Mrs. Chun with sharp blue eyes that missed very little. At 72, he had learned to read people quickly and accurately, a skill that had served him well in the military, in business, and in the decades he had spent teaching young people the disciplines of martial arts. "Is there a problem?" he asked, though his tone suggested he was more curious than concerned. "Quite the opposite," Mrs. Chun replied, then proceeded to give Hank a detailed account of the morning's events. As she spoke, she watched the old man's expression shift from attention to pride to something deeper, something that looked like profound satisfaction. When Mrs. Chun finished her story, Hank was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from her face to Marcus, who had climbed into the passenger seat and was clearly trying to make himself invisible. Finally, the old man smiled, and the expression transformed his weathered features completely. "Sounds like someone remembered his lessons," Hank said simply, but Marcus could hear volumes of approval and love in those few words. As they drove home through the tree-lined streets of Riverside, Marcus found himself recounting the day's events in greater detail, sharing not just what had happened, but how he had felt during each moment of the confrontation. Hank listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or asking a clarifying question, but mostly just providing the kind of presence that invited honesty. "I kept hearing your voice in my head," Marcus admitted as they turned onto Maple Street. "All those things you taught me about staying centered, about not letting other people's anger become your anger. But there was a moment when I wanted to show Tyler that I wasn't helpless, that I could handle him if I needed to." Hank nodded understanding. "That's natural," he said. "The training gives you confidence, and confidence can sometimes feel like it wants to be displayed. The real test isn't whether you feel that urge, but what you do with it." They pulled into the driveway of the small house that had become their home 6 months earlier. when Hank's declining health had prompted Marcus's mother to move them from Portland to be closer to better medical facilities. The house was modest but well-maintained, with a small garden that Hank tended with the same patience and attention he brought to everything else in his life. Inside, the walls were decorated with photographs from Hank's decades of teaching martial arts, images of students of all ages receiving belts, participating in demonstrations, and competing in tournaments. But the photos that held places of honor were not of victories or achievements, but of moments of connection, teaching, and community building. Marcus's mother, Jennifer Thompson, arrived home from her job at the county health department just as they were settling in for their usual post-school conversation. A nurse by training and temperament, Jennifer had inherited her father's ability to read people and situations with remarkable accuracy. She took one look at Marcus and immediately knew that something significant had happened. "How was your day?" she asked, the question carrying the weight of genuine interest rather than routine inquiry. As Marcus recounted the story for the third time, Jennifer found herself experiencing a complex mix of emotions: pride in her son's maturity and wisdom, concern about the bullying he had faced, and amazement at the way he had handled a situation that would have challenged most adults. But underneath those immediate reactions was a deeper sense of gratitude toward her father, whose patient guidance had shaped Marcus into someone capable of such grace under pressure. "I'm proud of you," Jennifer said when Marcus finished his account, "but I'm not surprised. You've been learning these lessons your whole life, not just in the dojo, but in how Grandpa treats everyone he meets, how he handles conflict, how he chooses kindness even when it's difficult." The observation highlighted something that Marcus was only beginning to understand fully. His martial arts training had been about much more than physical techniques or self-defense strategies. It had been a comprehensive education in how to move through the world with strength and compassion, how to respond to challenges with wisdom rather than reaction, how to see the humanity in others even when they were not showing it themselves. That evening, as the Thompson family shared dinner around their small kitchen table, the conversation kept returning to the day's events and their implications. Hank shared stories from his own youth, times when he had been tested and had not always responded with the wisdom he later developed. Jennifer talked about situations she encountered in her nursing work, moments when patience and empathy proved more effective than authority or force. But it was Marcus who asked the question that would shape the next phase of his experience at Lincoln Middle School. "What do I do now?" he wondered aloud. "Tyler wants to change, I think, but I don't know how to help him. And there are other kids at school who saw what happened today. Some of them look at me like they expect me to be some kind of hero or something." Hank set down his fork and looked at his grandson with the serious expression he reserved for the most important lessons. "The hardest part about doing the right thing," he said, "is that it often leads to people expecting you to keep doing it. Once you show that kind of strength, people start depending on it. That's a responsibility you can't take lightly." The weight of that responsibility was something Marcus had not fully considered. He had responded to Tyler's aggression in the moment, drawing on his training and his values to find a path that avoided violence while maintaining dignity. But he was beginning to understand that his response had created expectations and opportunities that extended far beyond that single confrontation. Jennifer reached across the table and squeezed her son's hand. "You don't have to have all the answers," she said gently. "You just have to keep being who you are, making good choices one situation at a time. If Tyler really wants to change, he'll do the work. If other kids are inspired by your example, that's wonderful. But you can't control how people respond to you. You can only control how you respond to them." The advice resonated with Marcus, offering a framework for navigating the new social landscape he had inadvertently created at school. He didn't have to become a crusader or a counselor or a leader in the traditional sense. He just had to continue being himself, applying the principles his grandfather had taught him to whatever situations arose. Later that evening, as Marcus worked on homework in his room. He could hear his mother and grandfather talking quietly in the kitchen. Their conversation drifted up the stairs, carrying words like proud and worried and ready. He understood that they were discussing not just the day's events, but the larger questions about his development and his future. At the same time, across town in a much larger house in Riverside's most prestigious neighborhood, Tyler Rodriguez was having a very different conversation with his parents. The phone call from the school had reached his mother first, followed by a more detailed discussion with Mrs. Chun that had left Carol Rodriguez feeling defensive and confused. Tyler's father, Roberto Rodriguez, had built his automotive dealership empire through a combination of aggressive business tactics and carefully cultivated relationships with local politicians and community leaders. He was not accustomed to his son being outmaneuvered by anyone, let alone by a quiet new kid who had somehow made Tyler look foolish without throwing a single punch. "I don't understand what happened today," Roberto said, his voice carrying the frustration of someone whose worldview had been challenged. "You're supposed to establish dominance early, make sure everyone knows not to mess with you. How did this kid get the better of you by doing nothing?" Tyler struggled to explain something. He was still trying to understand himself. The framework his father had given him for navigating social relationships had failed him completely when faced with Marcus's response. All of his strategies for intimidation and control had proven useless against someone who simply refused to be intimidated or controlled. "He didn't fight back," Tyler said, his voice uncertain. "But somehow that made him seem stronger, not weaker. And the things he said, they made me think about why I was doing what I was doing. I realized I didn't have a good answer." Carol Rodriguez looked between her husband and son, sensing undercurrents in the conversation that she didn't fully understand, but that clearly represented something significant. As someone who had built her career on reading people and situations accurately, she could see that Tyler was grappling with questions that went beyond the immediate incident at school. "Maybe," she said carefully, "we should think about what we can learn from this situation instead of just trying to figure out how to win next time." The suggestion surprised both Tyler and his father, representing a departure from the Rodriguez family's usual approach to conflict and competition. But Tyler found himself grateful for his mother's words, which offered a different way of thinking about the day's events. As the evening wore on, Tyler found himself alone in his room, staring at his reflection in the mirror that covered one wall of his oversized bedroom. For the first time in years, he really looked at himself, not just at his appearance, but at the person behind the image. What he saw was not entirely comfortable, but it was honest in a way that felt both frightening and necessary. The boy looking back at him was not the confident leader he had believed himself to be, but someone who had been using cruelty to mask his own insecurities and fears. The realization was painful, but it was also the beginning of something that might eventually become growth. Meanwhile, in homes throughout Riverside, other students from Lincoln Middle School were having their own conversations about the day's events. Some, like Lily Anderson, found themselves inspired by Marcus's example to think about their own responses to difficult situations. Others, like Jake Mitchell and Connor Walsh, were wrestling with uncomfortable questions about their own behavior and the choices they had made as part of Tyler's group. The ripple effects of Marcus's simple act of dignity were spreading through the community in ways that none of them could have predicted, touching lives and changing perspectives and directions that would continue to unfold in the days and weeks to come. What had begun as a typical bullying incident in a middle school classroom had become something much larger, a catalyst for the kind of transformation that educators and parents dream of but rarely witness. As Marcus finally turned off his bedroom light and settled into sleep, he thought about Tyler's question in the courtyard, the uncertainty in the other boy's voice as he admitted he didn't know how to be different. The question had revealed something important about the nature of change and the courage it took to acknowledge that the person you had been wasn't the person you wanted to continue being. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. But tonight, Marcus felt the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing he had chosen well in a moment that mattered. His grandfather's teachings had been tested in the crucible of real experience, and they had proven their worth not through victory over an opponent, but through the much more difficult achievement of maintaining integrity under pressure. Transformation that had begun in room 204 that morning was just getting started, and its ultimate impact would reach far beyond anything that Marcus Tyler or anyone else at Lincoln Middle School could imagine. 3 months after the dunce cap incident, Lincoln Middle School had become a fundamentally different place. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, nor had it been without its challenges and setbacks, but the seeds planted in room 204 that autumn morning had grown into something remarkable and lasting. Marcus Thompson had never intended to become a leader, but leadership had found him anyway. Not the kind of leadership that demanded followers or required a title, but the quiet influence that came from consistently choosing to do the right thing even when no one was watching. Students throughout the school had begun to notice how Marcus treated everyone with the same respect, how he listened when people spoke to him, how he seemed to find something positive in even the most difficult situations. The change was perhaps most evident in the cafeteria, where the rigid social hierarchies that had once dominated every lunch period had begun to soften and shift. Tables that had previously been exclusive territories for specific groups now hosted a more diverse mix of students, brought together not by status or popularity, but by genuine connection and shared interests. Marcus often found himself at the center of these more inclusive gatherings, not because he sought attention, but because his presence seemed to make others feel safe to be themselves. Lily Anderson had been one of the first to notice this shift. The shy 7th grader who had once eaten lunch alone while reading books had gradually found herself drawn into conversations with Marcus and the growing circle of students who seemed to gravitate toward his table. What amazed Lily was not just that Marcus included her, but that he had a way of asking questions that made her feel like her thoughts and opinions mattered. "I never thought anyone would want to hear about my poetry," Lily confided to Marcus one day as they walked together toward the library. "But when you asked about it, you actually listened to my answer. Most people just ask questions to be polite." Marcus smiled at the observation, remembering his grandfather's teachings about the difference between hearing and truly listening. "My grandfather always says that everyone has something interesting to share if you give them the chance," Marcus replied. "I guess I'm curious about what makes people excited about life." The philosophy had become contagious. Students who had previously focused only on their own social advancement began asking genuine questions about their classmates' interests and dreams. The art students started talking to the athletes about their training routines. The theater kids began conversations with the science enthusiasts about their latest experiments. These interactions didn't eliminate the natural groupings that formed around shared activities, but they created bridges that had never existed before. Tyler Rodriguez had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation of anyone at Lincoln Middle School. The change had not been easy or immediate, and there had been moments when he had reverted to his old patterns of behavior before catching himself and making different choices. But with each passing week, the boy who had once ruled through intimidation had become someone entirely different. The process had begun with small actions that felt almost revolutionary to Tyler. Instead of looking for opportunities to embarrass or belittle other students, he started noticing when they needed help or support. The first time he had stopped to help David Park pick up books that had been knocked from his arms. Both boys had been so surprised by the gesture that they had stood in the hallway staring at each other for several seconds before David managed to stammer out a thank you. But Tyler's most significant transformation had come through his evolving relationship with Marcus. What had started as grudging respect had deepened into something approaching friendship, built on honest conversations and mutual recognition of each other's growth. Marcus had never demanded an apology from Tyler for the dunce cap incident, but Tyler had offered one anyway, delivered with a sincerity that surprised them both. "I was trying to make myself feel important by making you feel small," Tyler had said during one of their talks. "I know that's messed up, and I know saying sorry doesn't undo what I did. But I want you to know that I understand now why it was wrong, not just because I got in trouble, but because I hurt someone who didn't deserve it." Marcus had accepted the apology with the same grace he had shown in responding to the original aggression, but he had also pushed Tyler to think more deeply about the implications of his behavior. "I forgive you," Marcus had said, "but the more important question is whether you can forgive yourself. And the only way to do that is to become someone who would never do something like that again." The conversation had marked a turning point in Tyler's understanding of accountability and redemption. He began to see that true change required more than just avoiding his previous mistakes. It demanded actively working to repair the damage he had caused and to build something better in its place. Tyler's transformation had not gone unnoticed by his parents, who had initially struggled to understand their son's new perspective and priorities. Roberto Rodriguez had been particularly resistant to what he saw as Tyler becoming soft or losing his competitive edge. But as the weeks passed and Tyler's grades improved, his relationships with teachers became more positive, and he began displaying the kind of leadership qualities that actually attracted rather than coerced followers. Even Roberto began to see the value in his son's new approach. "I don't understand how it works," Roberto admitted to his wife one evening as they watched Tyler helping the younger neighbor boy with his homework. "But whatever that Thompson kid taught our son seems to be making him stronger, not weaker." Carol Rodriguez had been quicker to embrace Tyler's changes, recognizing that her son was becoming not just a better student, but a better person. The angry edge that had characterized Tyler's interactions at home had softened into something more thoughtful and considerate. He asked about her day with genuine interest, offered to help with household tasks without being asked, and began including his younger sister in activities he had previously considered beneath his attention. The ripple effects of Tyler's transformation extended beyond his immediate family. Jake Mitchell and Connor Walsh, who had initially felt abandoned when Tyler stopped leading their small crew in acts of casual cruelty, gradually found themselves drawn into Tyler's new way of operating in the world. It was Jake who first tentatively suggested that maybe they should try being nice to people instead of looking for ways to mess with them, a proposal that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Connor's evolution had been perhaps the most gradual, his ingrained cynicism taking longer to soften than Jake's eager-to-please nature. But even Connor had begun to experience the satisfaction that came from being genuinely helpful rather than strategically harmful. The first time a younger student had thanked him for helping rather than cursing him for interference, Connor had felt something he had almost forgotten existed, the simple pleasure of being liked for good reasons. Mrs. Chun had watched these transformations unfold with the kind of professional satisfaction that reminded her why she had chosen teaching as a career. The changes in her classroom dynamics had been remarkable, not just because of the elimination of obvious bullying behaviors, but because of the emergence of genuine collaboration and mutual support among her students. She had also been instrumental in helping the school's administration recognize and build upon the positive changes that had emerged from that morning's incident. Principal Martinez had initially approached the situation from a traditional disciplinary perspective, focused on consequences and behavior modification. But Mrs. Chun had helped him see the opportunity to use Marcus's example as a foundation for broader discussions about school culture and community values. The result had been a series of school-wide initiatives that went far beyond typical anti-bullying programs. Instead of focusing primarily on what students shouldn't do, the new approach emphasized positive examples of leadership, courage, and compassion. Marcus had initially been reluctant to participate in formal recognition programs, uncomfortable with being singled out for what he saw as simply doing the right thing. But Henry Thompson had helped his grandson understand that accepting recognition was not about personal glory, but about inspiring others to make similar choices. When you let people celebrate your good actions, Hank had explained, you're not being prideful. You're showing them that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. That's a gift you can give to your community. The wisdom of that perspective became evident as Marcus's example began inspiring similar acts of courage and kindness throughout the school. Students who had previously been bystanders to bullying began speaking up on behalf of victims. Teachers noticed increased willingness among their students to help classmates who were struggling academically or socially. The atmosphere in hallways and common areas became noticeably more positive, with more laughter and fewer tensions. These changes had not eliminated all problems or conflicts at Lincoln Middle School. Adolescents were still adolescents, prone to the dramas and difficulties that came with their developmental stage. But the overall culture had shifted in a direction that supported growth, learning, and mutual respect rather than competition, exclusion, and cruelty. One of the most significant developments had been the establishment of a peer mediation program, initiated by Mrs. Chun but driven by student interest and participation. Marcus had been among the first volunteers, but he had insisted that Tyler also be included in the training. The decision had raised eyebrows among some faculty members, but Mrs. Chun had supported it, recognizing that Tyler's transformation from perpetrator to advocate gave him unique insights into the dynamics of conflict and reconciliation. The peer mediation sessions had become opportunities for students to work through disagreements and misunderstandings before they escalated into more serious problems. Marcus and Tyler often worked as a team, their shared history and different perspectives allowing them to connect with both sides of various disputes. During one particularly challenging session, involving two girls whose friendship had deteriorated into mutual accusations and social media drama, Tyler had drawn on his own experience to help them understand the destructive nature of trying to win conflicts rather than resolve them. I used to think that if I could make someone else look bad, it would make me look good, Tyler had shared with the feuding students. But what I learned is that when you tear other people down, you're really just digging yourself deeper into a hole. The only way to actually feel better about yourself is to build something positive. The insight had resonated with the girls, who had been so focused on proving themselves right that they had lost sight of what they were trying to achieve. Marcus had built on Tyler's observation by helping them identify what they valued about their friendship and what they were willing to do to preserve it. These mediation sessions had become some of the most rewarding experiences of Marcus's time at Lincoln Middle School. He discovered that he had a natural ability to help others see past their immediate emotions to the underlying issues that were driving their conflicts. The skills his grandfather had taught him for managing his own responses to difficulty proved equally valuable in helping others navigate their challenges. The success of the peer mediation program had attracted attention from other schools in the district, and Mrs. Chun had been invited to present their model educational conferences. The presentations always emphasized that the program's effectiveness was not due to any particular curriculum or structure, but to the culture of mutual respect and genuine care that had developed among the participating students. As winter gave way to spring, Marcus found himself reflecting on how much had changed since that first day at Lincoln Middle School when he had felt like a complete outsider. The boy who had once eaten lunch alone while studying his textbooks now found himself surrounded by friends who sought his advice, included him in their activities, and valued his perspective on everything from academic challenges to family problems. But perhaps the most meaningful change had been in his relationship with Tyler. What had begun as a confrontation between a bully and his intended victim had evolved into a friendship, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to making their school a better place. They still had very different personalities and interests, But they had discovered common values that transcended their surface differences. The friendship had been tested on several occasions when Tyler had slipped back into old patterns of behavior, or when Marcus had been forced to choose between loyalty to Tyler and standing up for what was right. But each challenge had ultimately strengthened their bond, proving that authentic relationships could survive honest disagreement and genuine accountability. One afternoon in late spring, as Marcus and Tyler worked together to set up equipment for a school assembly, Tyler brought up a question that had been on his mind for weeks. "Do you think people can really change?" Tyler asked, his voice carrying the uncertainty of someone who was still discovering who he wanted to become. "I mean, really change, not just pretend to be different until it's convenient to go back to being who you were before." Marcus considered the question while adjusting the height of a microphone stand. It was the kind of question his grandfather would have appreciated, deep and honest and worthy of careful thought. "I think people can change," Marcus replied finally, "but only if they want to badly enough to do the work it takes. And I think they have to change for their own reasons, not because someone else wants them to, or because they think it will get them something they want." Tyler nodded, recognizing the truth in Marcus's words. His own transformation had been most genuine during moments when he had forgotten about impressing others and had simply focused on being the kind of person he wanted to see when he looked in the mirror. "I know I'm different than I was," Tyler said, "but sometimes I worry that the old me is still in there somewhere, waiting for the right moment to come back out." Marcus stopped what he was doing and looked directly at his friend. "Maybe that's exactly why you won't go back," he said. "Because you're aware of that possibility and you're actively choosing something different every day. The people who don't change are usually the ones who think they don't need to." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of other students preparing for the assembly, but Tyler carried Marcus's words with him for the rest of the day. The idea that his awareness of his own capacity for regression might actually be a strength rather than a weakness was both comforting and empowering. The assembly that day was a celebration of student achievements throughout the school year, including recognition of the peer mediation program and its impact on school culture. As Principal Martinez spoke about the positive changes that had taken place at Lincoln Middle School, he made specific reference to the courage shown by students who had chosen to address conflicts through dialogue rather than aggression. Marcus felt uncomfortable with the indirect recognition, but he also understood that his discomfort was part of what made the recognition meaningful. Students who sought praise for their good actions often missed the point of doing good in the first place. The fact that Marcus would have preferred to remain anonymous was exactly why his example had been so powerful. After the assembly, as students filed out of the gymnasium, Marcus was approached by David Park, the small sixth grader who had been one of Tyler's early victims and had since become one of the most enthusiastic participants in the peer mediation program. "I just wanted to thank you," David said, his voice stronger and more confident than it had been at the beginning of the school year. "Not just for what you did that day in Mrs. Chun's class, but for showing all of us that we could be different than we thought we had to be." The gratitude in David's voice was echoed by several other students who had gathered around them, each offering their own version of appreciation for the changes that had taken place in their school community. Marcus found himself surrounded by classmates who had been transformed, not because he had told them to change, but because he had shown them what change could look like. As the crowd eventually dispersed and Marcus made his way toward the pickup area where his grandfather would be waiting, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. 6 months earlier, he had been the new kid who just wanted to blend in and avoid trouble. Now he was someone who had inadvertently catalyzed a transformation that had touched every aspect of his school community. Henry Thompson was indeed waiting in his familiar spot, his weathered hands resting on the steering wheel and his sharp blue eyes taking in the stream of students emerging from the building. When Marcus climbed into the passenger seat, Hank could immediately see that something significant had happened. "Good day," Hank asked, though the question was really an invitation for Marcus to share whatever was on his mind. "Yeah," Marcus replied, then paused to gather his thoughts. "I was just thinking about that first day when Tyler put the dunce cap on my head. At the time, it felt like the worst thing that could happen. But if it hadn't happened, none of the good stuff that came after would have happened either." Hank nodded, understanding the deeper wisdom his grandson was discovering. "That's one of the hardest lessons to learn," the old man said. "Sometimes the worst moments in our lives are also the moments that make the best parts possible. The key is figuring out how to find the opportunity in the difficulty." As they drove home through the familiar streets of Riverside, Marcus reflected on all the opportunities that had emerged from that difficult morning in room 204. His friendship with Tyler, his role in the peer mediation program, his growing confidence in his ability to help others navigate challenges, the transformation of his entire school community. None of it would have existed without that initial moment of crisis. The realization filled Marcus with a sense of gratitude that extended far beyond his own experience. He was grateful for his grandfather's teachings, which had prepared him to respond with wisdom rather than anger. He was grateful for Mrs. Chun's support and guidance, which had helped him understand the broader implications of his actions. He was grateful for Tyler's willingness to change, which had proven that even the most unlikely people could choose to become better versions of themselves. But perhaps most of all, Marcus was grateful for the opportunity to discover that ordinary moments could become extraordinary through simple choices to treat others with dignity and respect. The quiet new kid who had once felt invisible had learned that visibility wasn't about demanding attention, but about using whatever influence you had to lift others up. As spring turned toward summer and the school year drew to a close, the story of what had happened at Lincoln Middle School continued to spread beyond the boundaries of Riverside, Ohio. Other schools began implementing their own versions of peer mediation programs, inspired by the success that had grown from such humble beginnings. Educational researchers started studying the factors that had contributed to such a dramatic, positive change in school culture. But for Marcus Thompson, Tyler Rodriguez, and the other students whose lives had been touched by that autumn morning's events, the most important measure of success was not the recognition they received or the programs they had inspired. It was the simple knowledge that they had discovered something valuable about themselves and each other, something that would continue to shape their choices long after they left Lincoln Middle School behind. The boy who had been marked with a dunce cap as a symbol of humiliation had instead become a symbol of the transformative power of dignity, courage, and compassion. The bully who had sought to diminish others had learned to build them up instead. The teacher who had witnessed it all had found renewed faith in the potential of education to change not just minds but hearts. And in a small town in Ohio, a middle school had become a place where young people learned that strength came not from the ability to hurt others, but from the wisdom to help them heal and grow. The lessons learned in room 204 would echo through generations of students, proving that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simplest choice to respond to cruelty with kindness. The dunce cap had long since been thrown away, but the courage it had inadvertently inspired would last forever. The invitation arrived on a crisp October morning, printed on elegant cream-colored paper with Lincoln Middle School's letterhead embossed at the top. Marcus Thompson, now 18 and in his senior year at Riverside High School, read the formal script with a mixture of surprise and nostalgia. The school was hosting its first annual Character and Courage Awards ceremony, and he had been selected as the inaugural recipient of the newly established Dignity in Action Award. As Marcus set the invitation down on his desk, surrounded by college application materials and scholarship forms, he found his mind drifting back to that autumn morning 5 years earlier when his life at Lincoln Middle School had taken such an unexpected turn. The quiet 13-year-old who had simply wanted to avoid attention had somehow become someone whose actions were still being celebrated years later. The transformation that had begun in room 204 had continued throughout Marcus's high school years, though in ways he never could have anticipated. The principles his grandfather had taught him about strength, dignity, and respect had been tested repeatedly as he navigated the more complex social dynamics of Riverside High School. But each challenge had only reinforced his understanding that true leadership came not from commanding others, but from inspiring them through consistent example. Henry Thompson, now 77 and moving more slowly than he once had, still picked up his grandson from school each day. The ritual had become even more precious as Hank's health had gradually declined, making their daily conversations about school, life, and the application of martial arts principles to everyday challenges all the more meaningful. "They want to give me an award," Marcus told his grandfather as they drove home that afternoon, the invitation resting on the dashboard between them. Hank glanced at the formal paper and smiled with the quiet pride that had characterized his response to Marcus's achievements throughout the years. "What kind of award?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "For what happened with Tyler back in 7th grade, Marcus replied. "They're calling it the Dignity in Action Award, and they want me to speak at the ceremony about how that day changed things at the school." The old man was quiet for a moment, his weathered hands steady on the steering wheel as he navigated the familiar streets of their neighborhood. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of accumulated wisdom and deep satisfaction. "You know," Hank said, "when I started teaching you martial arts all those years ago, I never imagined that the most important fight you'd ever win would be one where you never threw a punch. But that's exactly what happened, isn't it? You won something much more valuable than any physical confrontation could have given you." Marcus nodded, understanding more fully now than he had at 13 what his grandfather meant. The victory he had achieved in room 204 had not been over Tyler Rodriguez, but over his own impulses toward anger and retaliation. It had been a victory of character over circumstance, of principle over reaction, of wisdom over the easy satisfaction of proving his physical capabilities. The years that followed had provided numerous opportunities to build upon that foundation. At Riverside High School, Marcus had become involved in student government, not because he sought political power, but because he wanted to help create the kind of inclusive environment he had experienced during his later years at Lincoln Middle School. His campaign for student body president had focused not on promises of better cafeteria food or more lenient hall pass policies, but on fostering genuine respect and understanding among students from different backgrounds and with different interests. Tyler Rodriguez had also thrived during his high school years, though his path had been somewhat different from Marcus's. The boy who had once been Lincoln Middle School's most feared bully had become Riverside High's most effective peer counselor, using his intimate understanding of the psychology of aggression and insecurity to help other students work through their own destructive impulses. Tyler's transformation had not been without its setbacks and challenges. There had been moments during his freshman year when the old patterns had reasserted themselves, when stress or frustration had triggered responses that reminded him uncomfortably of who he used to be. But each time, he had caught himself more quickly and made different choices, gradually building the kind of character that could withstand pressure without reverting to cruelty. The friendship between Marcus and Tyler had evolved and deepened throughout their high school years, becoming one of those rare relationships that seemed to bring out the best in both participants. They had supported each other through academic challenges, family difficulties, and the inevitable dramas of teenage life, always maintaining the honesty and mutual respect that had characterized their relationship since that first conversation. In the school courtyard, their senior year had brought new challenges as they prepared to head off to different colleges. Marcus to study education and psychology at Ohio State University, Tyler to pursue social work at Miami University. The prospect of separation after 5 years of close friendship was bittersweet, but both young men understood that their paths forward would allow them to carry the lessons they had learned together into new communities that could benefit from their example. Mrs. Sarah Chun, now in her 17th year of teaching at Lincoln Middle School, had watched the ripple effects of that autumn morning's events continue to spread throughout her career. The peer mediation program that had emerged from Marcus and Tyler's example had become a permanent part of the school's culture, with each new class of students learning about conflict resolution, empathy, and the power of choosing dignity over retaliation. The changes had been so significant that Lincoln Middle School had become a model for other institutions throughout Ohio and beyond. Educational researchers had documented the dramatic reduction in bullying incidents, the improvement in academic performance across all student populations, and the increase in reports of students feeling safe and supported at school. But for Mrs. Chun, the most meaningful measure of success was the transformation she witnessed in individual students year after year. Each fall brought new 7th graders who arrived carrying their own fears, insecurities, and learned patterns of behavior. Some came from elementary schools where they had been victims of bullying, others where they had been perpetrators, still others where they had simply learned to keep their heads down and avoid drawing attention to themselves. But within weeks of experiencing the culture that had grown from Marcus's example, these students began to discover new possibilities for how they could interact with their peers. The story of the dunce cap incident had become part of Lincoln Middle School's oral tradition, passed down from older students to younger ones, not as a lesson in what not to do, but as an example of what was possible when someone chose courage over conformity. The details of the story had evolved over the years, with each retelling adding elements that emphasized different aspects of the lesson, but the core message remained consistent. Real strength came from lifting others up, not from tearing them down. As the date of the awards ceremony approached, Marcus found himself reflecting on all the ways that single morning had shaped not just his own life, but the lives of countless others. The peer mediation program had helped resolve hundreds of conflicts before they could escalate into more serious problems. Students who had learned to see beyond surface differences had formed friendships that crossed traditional social boundaries. Teachers had discovered new ways to create classroom environments that supported both academic achievement and emotional growth. But perhaps the most significant impact had been on the broader community of Riverside itself. Parents who had heard their children talking about the positive changes at Lincoln Middle School had begun incorporating similar principles into their own family dynamics. Local businesses had started offering internships and mentorship opportunities, specifically designed to reinforce the values of respect and collaboration that the school was promoting. Community organizations had adopted conflict resolution strategies based on the peer mediation model. The transformation had been so comprehensive that it was sometimes hard to remember what things had been like before. Riverside had always been a decent place to live, but it had become something more than that. It had become a community where people genuinely looked out for each other, where differences were seen as opportunities for learning rather than reasons for division, where young people grew up understanding that their choices mattered not just for themselves, but for everyone around them. Marcus's parents, Jennifer and Henry Thompson, had watched their son's development with the kind of quiet pride that came from knowing they had played a role in shaping someone who was making a positive difference in the world. Jennifer's work as a nurse had given her countless opportunities to see the impact of the values Marcus had demonstrated throughout his teenage years, as former Lincoln Middle School students brought their understanding of empathy and service into their own chosen professions. Henry's declining health had made him even more appreciative of the time he had been able to spend teaching his grandson not just the physical techniques of martial arts, but the mental and emotional disciplines that had proven far more valuable in navigating real-world challenges. The old man took particular satisfaction in knowing that the lessons he had learned through decades of teaching and practice would continue to influence future generations through Marcus's example and the ripple effects it had created. The evening of the awards ceremony arrived with the crisp clarity that characterized autumn in Ohio. Lincoln Middle School's gymnasium had been transformed for the occasion, with banners celebrating the school's commitment to character development and community service. The audience included current students, faculty, parents, and community members who had been touched by the positive changes that had emerged from what had begun as a simple act of choosing dignity over retaliation. Principal Martinez, now in his 10th year at Lincoln Middle School, opened the ceremony by reflecting on how much the school had changed during his tenure. He spoke about test scores and academic achievements, but he spent more time discussing the transformation in school culture that had made those improvements possible. 5 years ago, Principal Martinez told the assembled crowd, "We had an incident in one of our classrooms that could have been just another example of bullying. Just another disciplinary problem to be handled and forgotten. Instead, it became the foundation for everything good that has happened at our school since then. It became a lesson in the power of individual choice to create community-wide change." As Marcus made his way to the podium to accept his award and deliver his remarks, he felt the familiar calm that had sustained him through countless challenging moments over the years. The principles his grandfather had taught him about staying centered under pressure served him well as he looked out at an audience that included many of the people who had been most influential in his development. Tyler Rodriguez sat in the front row, his presence both a reminder of how far they had both come and a source of ongoing support. Mrs. Chin sat nearby, her expression reflecting the satisfaction of an educator who had witnessed the best possible outcome of a difficult situation. Henry Thompson, despite his health challenges, had insisted on attending, his weathered face showing the deep contentment of someone who had lived to see his teachings bear fruit in ways he had hardly dared to hope. Marcus began his remarks by acknowledging that he had never intended to become a symbol of anything, that he had simply tried to respond to a difficult situation in the way his grandfather had taught him was right. But he had learned, he told the audience, that sometimes the most important moments in life were not the ones you planned for, but the ones that tested whether you would live up to your stated values when it was difficult to do so. That morning, in Mrs. Chun's classroom, Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the gymnasium, I had a choice to make. I could respond to Tyler's aggression with my own anger, or I could try to find a different way forward. I chose the path my grandfather had taught me, not because I thought it would change everything, but because it was the right thing to do in that moment. He paused, making eye contact with Tyler before continuing. What I learned that day, and in all the days since, is that every single one of us has the power to change the world around us. Not through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but through this simple choice to treat each person we encounter with dignity and respect, especially when they're not treating us the same way. The speech continued for several more minutes, with Marcus sharing specific examples of how the principles he had learned from his grandfather had been tested and refined through his experiences at both Lincoln Middle School and Riverside High School. He talked about the peer mediation program, about friendships that had formed across traditional social boundaries, about the satisfaction that came from helping others discover their own capacity for positive change. But the most powerful moment of his remarks came when he asked Tyler to join him at the podium. The two young men stood side by side, their friendship representing the kind of transformation that many people believed was impossible in the cynical world of modern adolescence. Tyler and I didn't become friends because we ignored what happened between us, Marcus said, with Tyler nodding in agreement beside him. We became friends because we were both willing to acknowledge it, learn from it, and commit to becoming better people because of it. That's what real forgiveness looks like, and that's what real change requires. Tyler took the microphone then, his voice steady despite the emotion that was clearly visible in his expression. 5 years ago, I was the kind of person who thought that making others feel small would make me feel big, he said. Marcus showed me that real strength comes from helping others discover their own power, not from taking it away from them. Everything good that has happened in my life since then has grown from that lesson. The audience's response was immediate and heartfelt, not just applause but the kind of emotional recognition that came from witnessing something genuinely meaningful. Parents who had worried about their children's safety and well-being in middle school found themselves moved to tears by the evidence that young people were capable of such wisdom and growth. Students who had been inspired by Marcus and Tyler's example felt validated in their own choices to prioritize kindness over cruelty. As the ceremony concluded and people began to mingle in the reception that followed, Marcus found himself surrounded by current Lincoln Middle School students who had heard the story of the dunce cap incident but had never met the person at its center. Their questions reflected both curiosity about the events themselves and genuine interest in understanding how to apply similar principles in their own lives. "How do you stay calm when someone is being mean to you?" asked a 7th grade girl whose earnest expression reminded Marcus of himself at that age. "Practice," Marcus replied with a smile. "My grandfather taught me that courage isn't about not being afraid or upset. It's about feeling those things and still choosing to do what's right. The more you practice making good choices in small situations, the easier it becomes to make them in big ones." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Marcus and Tyler both sharing stories and insights from their high school experiences. What struck Marcus most powerfully was how hungry these young students were for examples of how to navigate the complex social and emotional challenges of adolescence with integrity and wisdom. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Marcus found himself walking through the halls of Lincoln Middle School with Tyler, Mrs. Chun, and his grandfather. The building looked much the same as it had 5 years earlier, but the atmosphere felt completely different. The walls were covered with student artwork celebrating diversity and inclusion. Bulletin boards displayed essays about conflict resolution and community service. The overall feeling was one of warmth and safety rather than tension and competition. They paused outside room 204, where a small plaque now commemorated the establishment of the peer mediation program and its impact on school culture. Mrs. Chun unlocked the door so they could step inside, and Marcus was struck by how ordinary the space looked. Nothing about the room itself suggested that it had been the site of such a transformative moment. "It's funny," Tyler said, looking around the classroom where his attempt to humiliate Marcus had instead begun his own journey toward becoming a better person. "I used to think this room was where my reputation was destroyed. Now I realize it was where my real life began." Henry Thompson, who had been listening quietly to the conversations throughout the evening, finally spoke up. "That's the thing about real change," the old man said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed transformation in many different contexts over his long life. "It doesn't usually happen in the places or ways we expect. It happens when we're ready to receive it, and when we're brave enough to act on what we learn." As they prepared to leave the school, Marcus took one last look around room 204, remembering not just the confrontation that had taken place there, but all the lessons that had grown from it. The scared 13-year-old who had sat in one of these desks wearing a dunce cap and trying to figure out how to respond to public humiliation had discovered something that would shape the rest of his life. The drive home was quiet, with each person lost in their own reflections on the evening's events and their significance. Marcus found himself thinking about the future, about the college years that lay ahead and the opportunities they would bring to apply everything he had learned in new contexts with new people facing new challenges. But he also found himself thinking about the past, about all the people who had contributed to his development, and the countless small moments that had built toward this recognition. His grandfather's patient teaching, his mother's unwavering support, Mrs. Chin's wise guidance, Tyler's willingness to change, the countless other students and teachers and community members who had played roles in creating the positive culture that now characterized Lincoln Middle School. Most of all, Marcus thought about the power of individual choice to create collective transformation. The decision he had made in room 204 to respond to cruelty with dignity had been his alone, but its impact had extended far beyond anything he could have imagined at the time. It had taught him that ordinary people in ordinary moments had the key power to create extraordinary change, not through force or manipulation, but through this simple commitment to treating others with respect and compassion. As they pulled into the driveway of their modest home on Maple Street, Henry Thompson turned to his grandson with an expression of deep satisfaction and profound love. "I'm proud of you," the old man said simply. "Not because of the award or the recognition, but because of who you've chosen to become. That's the real victory, and it's one that will keep paying dividends for the rest of your life." Marcus nodded, understanding that his grandfather was referring not just to his own development, but to the ongoing impact that his choices would continue to have on others. The story that had begun with a dunce cap and a moment of decision was far from over. It would continue through his college years, his career, his eventual family, and all the other young people who would learn from his example that strength and kindness were not opposites, but partners in the most important work of building a better world. The quiet new kid who had wanted nothing more than to blend in had learned that true invisibility came not from avoiding notice but from focusing so completely on serving others that your own ego became irrelevant. It was a lesson that would serve him well in whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead, and it was a legacy that would continue to inspire positive change long after his own story had become part of the history that future students would learn from and build upon. The dunce cap had been thrown away years ago, but the courage it had accidentally awakened would last forever, spreading from person to person, generation to generation, proving that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin with the simple decision to respond to hate with love, to cruelty with kindness, and to the worst in human nature with an unwavering commitment to bringing out the best. 20 years had passed since that autumn morning in room 204, and Marcus Thompson stood once again in the familiar halls of Lincoln Middle School, though this time his role had fundamentally changed. At 33, he had returned to Riverside, not as a student or even a visitor, but as the newly appointed principal of the very school where his understanding of leadership and courage had first been forged. The decision to return had not been an easy one. Marcus had built a successful career in education, starting as a middle school counselor in Columbus, then moving into administration at progressively larger districts throughout Ohio. His reputation for creating positive school cultures and turning around struggling institutions had earned him offers from prestigious districts in major cities across the country. But when the opportunity arose to lead Lincoln Middle School, something deeper than professional ambition had called him home. Henry Thompson had passed away 3 years earlier, at the age of 81, his final years enriched by the knowledge that his grandson had not only absorbed the lessons he had tried to teach but had become someone who could pass those lessons on to future generations. In his final conversation with Marcus, Hank had expressed a single wish that his teachings would continue to spread through the young people Marcus would encounter in his career. The circle of influence had indeed continued to expand in ways that would have amazed the old martial arts instructor. Tyler Rodriguez, now Dr. Tyler Rodriguez, had completed his doctorate in social work and established a nonprofit organization focused on conflict resolution and restorative justice in schools throughout the Midwest. His work had helped transform disciplinary practices in dozens of districts, moving them away from punitive approaches toward methods that emphasized healing, growth, and community building. Mrs. Sarah Chun had retired 5 years earlier after A distinguished career that had seen her transition from classroom teacher to curriculum coordinator to assistant principal. Her pioneering work in peer mediation had been studied and replicated in educational institutions across the country, but she always insisted that the real credit belonged to the students, who had shown her what was possible when young people were given the tools and trust to solve problems together. The Lincoln Middle School that Marcus now led bore little resemblance to the institution he had first entered as a frightened 13-year-old. The physical building had been renovated and expanded, but more importantly, the culture had evolved into something that consistently produced remarkable outcomes, not just in academic achievement, but in character development and community engagement. The peer mediation program that had emerged from Marcus and Tyler's example had become the foundation for a comprehensive approach to social-emotional learning that was integrated into every aspect of the school experience. Students learned conflict resolution skills alongside mathematics, practiced empathy exercises in conjunction with literature studies, and participated in community service projects that connected their academic learning to real-world impact. On his first day as principal, Marcus had walked through every classroom, reacquainting himself with spaces that held profound personal significance, while also observing how they were being used to educate a new generation of students. When he reached room 204, he found it occupied by Ms. Jennifer Walsh, a young teacher in her second year who was leading her 7th grade history class through a discussion about moral courage during the civil rights movement. The conversation was sophisticated and nuanced, with students drawing connections between historical examples of individuals who had stood up for their principles and contemporary situations they might face in their own lives. Marcus listened from the doorway as 13-year-olds discussed the difference between physical bravery and moral courage, the importance of standing up for others even when it was difficult, and the way individual actions could inspire broader social change. One student, a quiet girl named Amelia, whose dark hair and serious expression reminded Marcus powerfully of himself at that age, raised her hand to share an observation that took his breath away. "I think the hardest kind of courage," Amelia said, her voice thoughtful and precise, "is when you have to be kind to someone who's being mean to you. It's easy to be mean back, and it's easy to just ignore them. But being kind when someone doesn't deserve it, that takes real strength." Ms. Walsh nodded approvingly and was about to respond when she noticed Marcus in the doorway. She gestured for him to join the discussion, introducing him to the class as their new principal and explaining that he was also a graduate of Lincoln Middle School. Marcus accepted the invitation to address the students, though he felt a familiar flutter of nervousness as he faced a classroom full of 7th graders in the very room where his own understanding of courage had been tested and refined. He looked around at their expectant faces, seeing in them the same mixture of curiosity, insecurity, and potential that had characterized his own middle school experience. "Amelia just said something really important," Marcus began, his voice carrying the authority that came from years of educational leadership, but also the authenticity of someone who had personally experienced the truth he was sharing. "She's right that being kind to someone who's being unkind to you is one of the hardest things you can do. But it's also one of the most powerful." He paused, gathering his thoughts and feeling the weight of the moment. "When I was in 7th grade, sitting in this very room, I had an experience that taught me exactly what Amelia is talking about. Someone tried to embarrass me in front of the whole class, and I had a choice to make about how to respond." The students leaned forward with interest, sensing that their new principal was about to share something significant. Marcus could see genuine curiosity in their faces, the same hunger for authentic guidance that he remembered feeling at their age. "I could have gotten angry and tried to embarrass him back," Marcus continued. "I could have ignored what happened and pretended it didn't bother me. Or I could try to respond in a way that showed him, and everyone else in the room, what real strength looked like. I chose the third option, and it changed not just that moment, but everything that came after. For the next 15 minutes, Marcus shared a carefully edited version of the dunce cap incident, focusing not on the specific details, but on the principles and choices that had shaped his response. He talked about his grandfather's teachings, about the difference between reacting and responding, about the way individual decisions could create ripple effects that extended far beyond what anyone could predict. The students asked thoughtful questions about how to apply these principles in their own lives, sharing scenarios they had encountered with bullying, peer pressure, and social conflict. Marcus was struck by how similar their challenges were to what he had faced 20 years earlier, despite all the technological and cultural changes that had occurred in the intervening decades. When the class period ended and students began filing out for their next period, Amelia approached Marcus with the same kind of serious determination he remembered feeling when he had important questions to ask adults. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "the person who tried to embarrass you in this room, did they ever apologize? Did they change?" Marcus smiled at the question, recognizing the deeper inquiry about whether people were capable of genuine transformation. "Not only did he apologize," Marcus replied, "but he became one of my closest friends. He learned to use his influence to help other people instead of hurting them. Sometimes the people who seem the meanest are actually the ones who need the most help learning how to be kind." The answer seemed to satisfy Amelia, who nodded thoughtfully before heading off to her next class. But her question stayed with Marcus throughout the rest of his first day, reminding him of the importance of maintaining hope for human transformation, even in the face of behavior that seemed irredeemable. That evening, Marcus called Tyler to share the details of his first day and the conversation that had taken place in room 204. Tyler, now living in Chicago but maintaining strong connections to his hometown, listened with the kind of engaged attention that had characterized their friendship for 2 decades. "It's amazing how the same room can hold so many different stories," Tyler reflected. 20 years ago, that was where I learned what I was capable of when I chose cruelty. Today, it's where kids are learning what they're capable of when they choose kindness." The observation captured something profound about the nature of physical spaces and their relationship to the events that unfold within them. Room 204 had not changed fundamentally in its structure or appearance, but the energy and possibilities it contained had been completely transformed by the accumulated experiences and lessons of the people who had occupied it. Over the following weeks, Marcus established routines and relationships that allowed him to understand the current culture of Lincoln Middle School, while also identifying opportunities for continued growth and improvement. He met regularly with students, teachers, and parents, listening to their perspectives on what was working well and what could be enhanced. What impressed him most was the degree to which the values he and Tyler had helped establish 20 years earlier had become embedded in the institutional DNA of the school. Students genuinely looked out for each other across traditional social boundaries. Teachers approached discipline with curiosity and compassion rather than punishment and control. Parents felt confident that their children were not just learning academic content, but developing character and life skills that would serve them well beyond their middle school years. But Marcus also recognized that maintaining and building upon this positive culture required constant attention and intentional effort. Each new class of students brought fresh challenges and opportunities. Social media and digital communication had created new venues for both connection and conflict that required updated approaches to character education and conflict resolution. 6 months into his tenure as principal, Marcus decided to formalize something that had been operating informally. For years, he established the Legacy Leaders Program, designed to connect current students with graduates who had been positively influenced by their Lincoln Middle School experience and were now making contributions in their communities and professions. Tyler was among the first alumni to participate, returning to the school regularly to lead workshops on conflict resolution and restorative justice. But the program also included teachers, nurses, social workers, business owners, artists, and community organizers who could share diverse perspectives on how the character development they had experienced at Lincoln Middle School had influenced their life choices and career paths. The program's inaugural event was held in the school gymnasium, with nearly 200 current students gathering to hear from a panel of graduates representing different decades and different paths in life. Marcus served as the moderator, guiding a conversation that explored themes of leadership, service, and the ongoing responsibility to contribute positively to the communities where the graduates now lived and worked. During the question and answer session, a 8th grade boy named Jordan raised his hand to ask a question that reminded Marcus powerfully of his own curiosity at that age. "How do you know when you're making the right choice?" Jordan asked. "Sometimes it's hard to tell what the right thing to do is, especially when different people are telling you different things." The question prompted responses from several panel members, each offering their own perspective based on their personal and professional experiences. But it was Tyler who provided the answer that seemed to resonate most deeply with the students. "I think," Tyler said, "the right choice is usually the one that makes things better for other people, not just for yourself. When I was your age, I made a lot of wrong choices because I was only thinking about what would make me feel powerful or important in the moment. I wasn't thinking about how my actions affected others or what kind of person I was becoming." He paused, making eye contact with students throughout the audience. "The best decision-making tool I ever learned was to ask myself, will this choice make me proud of who I am in 5 years? Will it make the people I care about proud of me? Will it make my community better? If the answer is yes to all three questions, it's probably the right choice." The framework provided students with a practical method for evaluating their options in difficult situations, but it also reinforced the values that had become central to Lincoln Middle School's culture. Individual choices mattered, not just for their immediate consequences, but for their long-term impact on character development and community well-being. As the event concluded and students began to disperse, Marcus found himself surrounded by young people who wanted to continue the conversations that had been started during the formal program. Their questions revealed both the timeless nature of adolescent challenges and the specific concerns of their generation. They asked about dealing with cyberbullying, about navigating social media pressures, about finding the courage to stand up for classmates who were being excluded or marginalized. They wanted to know how to maintain their values when those around them were making different choices, how to be leaders without being bossy, how to help friends who were struggling without becoming overwhelmed by problems they couldn't solve. Marcus listened to each question with the kind of attention his grandfather had shown him decades earlier, recognizing that these young people were seeking not just advice, but affirmation that their concerns were valid and their desire to do the right thing was valuable. He responded with honesty about the complexity of the issues they raised while also expressing confidence in their ability to find good solutions. As the gymnasium finally emptied and Marcus began the process of cleaning up after the event, he found himself thinking about the continuous nature of the work he had chosen. Each generation of students brought fresh energy and new perspectives, but they also faced the same fundamental challenges of learning how to treat each other with respect, how to navigate conflict constructively, and how to use their individual talents and opportunities in service of something larger than themselves. The work was never finished, but that was also what made it meaningful. Every day brought new opportunities to plant seeds that might not fully bloom for years or even decades. Every interaction with the student carried the potential to influence not just that young person's immediate choices, but the kind of adult they would eventually become and the impact they would have on their own communities. Walking through the quiet halls of Lincoln Middle School that evening, Marcus felt the weight and privilege of his responsibility as an educator and leader. The scared 13-year-old who had once worn a dunce cap in room 204 had become someone entrusted with shaping the experiences of hundreds of young people each year. The journey from student to principal had been filled with challenges and growth opportunities that had tested and refined everything his grandfather had taught him about character, courage, and service. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of his story was how ordinary it had been in many ways. He had not possessed any special talents or advantages that set him apart from his peers. What had made the difference was the decision to respond to a difficult moment with dignity rather than anger, and then to build consistently upon that foundation through years of daily choices to prioritize kindness, integrity, and service to others. As Marcus locked the school building and headed home to his own family, he carried with him the satisfaction that came from knowing he was continuing work that had been started long before him and would continue long after him. The lessons his grandfather had taught him were now being passed on to a new generation of students who would carry them forward into their own futures, creating ripple effects that would extend far beyond anything he could imagine or control. The circle that had begun with an old man teaching his grandson about martial arts and character had expanded to encompass an entire school community and would continue expanding as long as people chose to respond to the worst in human nature with the best in themselves. It was a legacy built not on grand gestures or dramatic moments, but on the accumulated impact of countless small decisions to treat each person with dignity and respect. The dunce cap was long gone, but the courage it had accidentally inspired would continue forever, proving that sometimes the most powerful transformations begin with the simplest choice to respond to hate with love. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.